Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the trail dust never settles and the legends of the American West are carved in stone and smoke. We're here to tell the stories of the grit, the grief, and the gunpowder that shaped a nation. Before we take cover from the coming storm in tonight's tale, do us a kindness and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to ring that notification bell. That way, you'll never be left out in the cold when a new story rides in. Now, bolt the door, stoke the fire, and listen close to the tale of the widow, the stranger, and the longest night in the Arizona Territory. The storm was not just weather, it was a living, breathing entity. It was a monster of wind and water, clawing at the lonely cabin of Sarah Vance with a fury that seemed personal. The rain came in horizontal sheets, hammering against the sturdy pine logs of the small house her husband, Daniel, had built with his own two hands. The wind howled through the eaves, a mournful, keening sound that mimicked the permanent ache in Sarah's own heart. For 2 years, since the day she had buried Daniel and their 7-year-old son, Lucas, this cabin had been her fortress and her prison. It was the only piece of them she had left, a sanctuary of memories nestled in a high, lonely valley. The silence within its walls was usually absolute, a heavy blanket she wrapped around herself. But tonight, the storm filled that silence with a rage that mirrored the one she kept locked deep inside. She was stoking the fire, the warm glow pushing back against the oppressive, rain-streaked darkness, when the sound came. It was a sound so out of place in the tempest that she at first thought the wind was playing tricks on her. Thump, thump, thump. It was a fist, weak but insistent, against her heavy wooden door. Every instinct, honed by 2 years of solitary survival, screamed at her. No sane person was out in this. No honest traveler would be this far from the main trail, especially not on a night that God himself seemed to have abandoned. Her hand went to the old, worn shotgun she kept propped against the hearth, its stock smooth and familiar in her palm. Thump, thump. The sound was weaker now, followed by a heavy slump against the door. Sarah stood frozen, the shotgun held at the ready. Her heart, a cold, dormant thing, hammered against her ribs. To open the door was to invite the violent, unpredictable world into the last safe place she had. To leave it shut was to potentially condemn a man to death on her doorstep. Daniel would have opened it without a second thought. The memory of his easy and questioning kindness was a painful stab of guilt. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice rough from disuse, but loud enough to carry over the wind's shriek. A low groan was the only answer. Cursing her own compassion, a trait she thought had been buried with her family, Sarah moved to the door. She slid the heavy iron bolt back, her knuckles white. With the shotgun held tight in one hand, she cracked the door open a few inches and peered out into the maelstrom. A man was slumped against the frame, a dark, sodden heap. He was soaked to the bone, his face a pale blur in the gloom, matted with wet hair and what looked like blood. His horse, a magnificent but exhausted-looking black stallion, stood a few feet away, its head bowed against the driving rain. "Please," the man rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "My horse threw me. A rock slide in the pass. I think my leg is broken." He tried to push himself up, then collapsed back with a sharp intake of breath. "Just for the storm to pass. Please." Sarah hesitated for a heartbeat longer. He was large, even slumped as he was, and the darkness hid his features. But the desperation in his voice sounded genuine, and the horse was clearly a fine animal, not the usual scrub mount of a common drifter. Against every warning bell clanging in her mind, she made a decision. She was a doctor's daughter and a frontiersman's widow. She did not have it in her to leave a man to die in a storm. "All right," she said, her voice sharp and devoid of warmth. "But you'll do exactly as I say." "Understood." "Understood," he breathed, a wave of what looked like genuine relief washing over his face. Getting him inside was a monumental effort. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of wet wool and pain muscle. She managed to drag him across the threshold and onto the bearskin rug in front of the fire. The storm slammed the door shut behind them with a definitive crash, as if sealing them in together. The cabin, which had always felt like a sanctuary, suddenly felt small, cramped, a cage. The stranger lay by her fire, his ragged breathing filling the silence. Sarah stood over him, the shotgun still in her hand, the rain dripping from his clothes to form a dark, fretting pool on her floor. She had let the monster of the storm into her home, and she had no idea if it had a human face. The first order of business was to assess the damage. Sarah, pragmatic and methodical, knew that a wounded man was a less dangerous man. She propped the shotgun against the wall, within easy reach, and knelt beside him. The heat from the fire was already beginning to steam the dampness from his clothes, filling the small cabin with the smell of wet earth, horse, and something else. Something metallic and sharp, a blood. "Let's see this leg," she said, her tone clinical, the one she had heard her father use 1,000 times. The stranger grunted in assent, his eyes closed. He was wearing heavy, mud-caked trousers. As she began to work the fabric up his calf, her fingers brushed against something hard strapped to his leg. A knife. The sheath was worn, the hilt a simple, unadorned piece of dark wood. It was a practical, deadly tool. A shiver, cold and unwelcome, traced its way down her spine. Of course a man on the trail would carry a knife. Still, the leg was not broken. It was a nasty sprain, the ankle already swollen to twice its normal size, but the bone was intact. The blood, she realized, was not from his leg. It was seeping from a dark, ugly wound high on his left shoulder, a ragged tear in his heavy wool coat. "You said your horse threw you," she stated, her voice flat, her eyes fixed on the wound. "It did," he rasped, his eyes still closed. "Caught a branch as I fell. Tore me up some." It was a plausible explanation. But the wound didn't look like a tear from a branch. It looked punched through. She would have to see it without the coat. "We need to get this wet coat off before you catch your death," she said. With his pained, clumsy assistance, she managed to wrestle the heavy, sodden coat off him. The shirt beneath was stained crimson. As she pulled the coat away, something heavy in an inside pocket swung out and landed on the floor with a solid, metallic thud. It was a revolver. But it was unlike any she had seen before. It was not the standard Colt or Remington. It was a massive, intimidating weapon, with a secondary, smaller barrel nestled beneath the main one. A lawmen. A grape-shot revolver, they called it. A rare and fearsome weapon, part revolver, part shotgun, favored by Confederate officers and, she had heard in hushed whispers, by the most ruthless and professional of killers. It was a weapon designed for one purpose, maximum carnage. Her blood ran cold. She stared at the gun, then looked at the man's face. His eyes were open now, watching her. They were the color of a winter sky, pale gray and utterly devoid of warmth. They were watchful, intelligent, and as cold as a hangman's heart. "That's quite a firearm," she said, her voice betraying none of the sudden, sickening lurch she felt in her stomach. "A man needs an advantage in this country," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He made a move to reach for the gun. "Leave it," she said, the command sharp and sudden. His hand froze. Their eyes met, and in that moment, a silent and spoken understanding passed between them. She was not a helpless woman, and he was not a simple, unlucky traveler. The roles they were playing were just that, roles. And they both knew it. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, and let his hand fall away. Sarah turned her attention back to the wound, her mind racing. The lawmen. The cold eyes. The story that didn't quite fit. A memory, dark and fragmented, stirred in the back of her mind. 2 years ago, the posse that had found Daniel and Lucas, they had spoken of the tracks they'd found. A large, shod stallion. And a single, strange shell casing they couldn't identify. A shotgun shell, but smaller. The kind a lawmen revolver might fire. She pushed the thought down. It was a coincidence. The territory was full of strange men with strange guns. Her grief was making her see ghosts where there were none. She took a sharp knife and began to cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. The wound was now fully exposed, and the sight of it made the air freeze in her lungs. It was not a tear from a branch. It was a bullet wound. Clean, round, and deep. It had gone through the fleshy part of his shoulder from the back, exiting in a more ragged tear at the front. It was recent, a day or two old at most. And it was almost identical to the wound her husband had described healing on a captured outlaw just a month before he was killed. A through and through, Daniel had called it. "The luckiest unlucky man I've ever seen." The ball passed right between the bone and the artery. Another half-inch to the left, he'd have bled out in minutes. The words echoed in her mind, a ghostly whisper from the past. A chill, so profound it felt like a physical touch, spread through her entire body. She looked from the distinctive wound to the man's pale, cold eyes. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. He saw the change in her face, the flicker of recognition, the dawning horror. "The branch must have been perfectly round," she said, her voice a dead, flat whisper. A slow, cold smile touched the corner of his lips. It did not reach his eyes. "The wilderness is full of surprises," he said softly. In that moment, she knew. She didn't have proof, not yet. But she knew in her bones, in the deepest, most wounded part of her soul, that she had just opened her door to the man who had murdered her family. The glimmer of doubt had become a raging, silent inferno. And the storm outside had nothing on the one that was about to break within the four walls of her home. The storm did not abate. For 2 more days, it held the valley in its thrall, a relentless siege of wind and water that turned the world outside Sarah's windows into a gray, blurred nightmare. The creek at the bottom of the valley, normally a gentle, meandering thing, had become a raging brown torrent, making any thought of travel impossible. The cabin, once her sanctuary, had become a pressure cooker, there thick with unspoken questions and the constant, simmering threat of violence. A fragile, terrifying routine established itself. Sarah was the reluctant nurse, he the wary patient. She cleaned and bandaged his wound twice a day, her movements clinical and detached, her mind a whirlwind of terror and calculation. Every touch was a violation, every moment spent in his presence a torment. She was tending to the health of the man who had destroyed her life, and the bitter irony of it was a poison in her veins. His name, he said, was Jonah. He offered no surname. He claimed to be a trapper, heading north before the winter snows sealed the high passes. His story was a patchwork of plausible lies, but his eyes told a different tale. They were never still, constantly scanning the room, assessing angles, noting the position of the shotgun by the hearth, the knife on the mantelpiece, the heavy iron poker by the fire. He was a predator, even when wounded, and he was mapping the confines of his temporary cage. Sarah played her part. She was the wary but compassionate homesteader. She fed him simple meals of stew and hard biscuits, which they ate in a tense, crackling silence on opposite sides of the small wooden table. The scrape of a spoon against a bowl sounded like a gunshot. The creak of a floorboard was an alarm. "You're a long way out here for a woman alone," he said on the second day, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question, it was a probe. "My husband built this cabin," she replied, her voice carefully neutral, her eyes on her stew. "He was a good man. Strong." She chose the past tense deliberately, a piece of bait to see if he would bite. "Was?" Jonah asked, his gaze sharpening. "He and my son were killed 2 years ago," Sarah said, the words costing her more than he could ever know. "Bandits." She looked up then, meeting his cold, gray eyes directly. "They were never caught." For a fleeting instant, she saw something in his eyes. A flicker of something other than cold calculation. Was it interest? Surprise? Or was it the smug, predatory glint of a wolf hearing the bleat of a familiar lamb? The moment passed, and his face was a mask once more. "This is a hard country," he said, the platitude an insult. "It takes more than it gives." Sarah knew she had to be careful. He was wounded, but he was still immensely strong. His gun, the monstrous limit, lay on the mantelpiece, a constant, silent threat. She had moved it there, claiming it needed to be kept dry, but the real reason was to keep it in her line of sight. Her own shotgun never left its place by the hearth. The cabin was a chessboard, and the two of them were the only pieces, circling each other, waiting for a mistake. She found herself studying him, cataloging details, searching for the crack in his facade. The way he moved, even with his sprained ankle, was with a coiled, efficient grace. The way he handled a knife while eating, the way his eyes tracked the flight of a bird through the window, it all spoke of a man for whom violence was not an event, but a language. The storm-bound days were a unique and terrible form of torture. She was trapped with her deepest trauma, forced to share her food, her fire, her very air with the monster from her nightmares. The memories of that day, the memories she fought so hard to keep buried, were now clawing their way to the surface. She would be stirring a pot and would suddenly see the image of Daniel's face, a look of shocked betrayal in his eyes. She would be folding a blanket and would feel the phantom weight of Lucas in her arms. The grief was no longer a dull ache, it was a fresh, open wound again, and its salt was the presence of the man sitting just a few feet away. The need for proof, for absolute certainty, became an obsession. It was the only thing that kept her from grabbing the shotgun and ending it, one way or another. She had to know. On the third night, the rain lessened, but the wind rose to a new, hysterical pitch, rattling the window frames and making the whole cabin groan like a ship in a heavy sea. Sleep was impossible. They sat by the fire, the silence stretching between them, thick and heavy. "You're good with a bandage," Jonah said, breaking the silence. His voice was different, softer. A new tactic. "Your husband, was he a doctor?" The question was a direct hit. Sarah's composure, stretched thin for 3 days, almost snapped. She gripped the arms of her rocking chair, her knuckles white. "No," she said, her voice tight. "My father was a doctor." "He taught you well," Jonah observed. "He taught me many things," Sarah said, her voice low and dangerous. "He taught me how to diagnose an illness. And he taught me how to cut out a cancer before it spreads." The double meaning hung in the air between them, sharp and clear as a razor's edge. Jonah looked at her, and this time, the cold smile was not a flicker. It was a slow, deliberate spreading of his lips, a look of chilling, reptilian amusement. He had heard her threat, and he was not afraid. "A useful skill," he said, his voice a purr. "For a woman alone." The walls of the cabin felt like they were pressing in on her, the air thick and unbreathable. She knew then that this could not go on. The storm would break eventually, and he would leave, disappearing back into the world, leaving her with the poison of her unproven certainty. She had to find the proof. She had to find it soon, before the storm ended, and before the one raging inside her consumed her completely. The storm raged, but inside Sarah's mind, a different tempest was gathering force. The presence of the man she called Jonah was a key, unlocking a room in her memory she had kept bolted shut for 2 years. The memories of that last, perfect day, and the horror that followed, now returned not as fragmented nightmares, but with a vivid, agonizing clarity. It had been a day of impossible, late autumn beauty. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the air was crisp with the promise of the coming winter. Daniel had been mending a fence on the north pasture, his hammer falls a steady, reassuring rhythm that echoed through the valley. 7-year-old Lucas, his hair the color of sun-cured hay, was helping, which mostly consisted of chasing grasshoppers and proudly carrying single-fence staples in his small, grubby hands. Sarah had been in her garden, humming a tune as she gathered the last of the season's vegetables. She remembered the simple, profound contentment of that moment, the feeling of a life so perfectly, beautifully right. The smell of the rich earth, the warmth of the sun on her back, the distant sound of her husband, and so it was a memory so perfect it now felt like a cruel joke. The attack had come without warning. They had not ridden in like a band of common raiders, shouting and firing into the air. They had been silent, professional, emerging from the line of cottonwood trees by the creek like wolves materializing from the shadows. There were 3 of them. One was a large, brutish man with a tangled beard. Another was younger, almost a boy, with nervous, twitchy movements. But the leader, the one who had seared himself into her memory, was different. He sat on his magnificent black stallion with an unnatural stillness, his face calm, his eyes a pale, chilling gray. He was wearing a long, dark duster, and the gun on his hip was a strange, heavy-looking thing she didn't recognize. Daniel had seen them first. He had straightened up from his work, his hand going instinctively to the old Remington he carried while working the fence line. Lucas, sensing the sudden tension, had run to his father's side, clinging to his leg. "This is private property," Daniel had called out, his voice strong and steady, but Sarah, who knew him better than her own heart, had heard the tremor of unease beneath it. The leader had smiled then, a slow, cold smile that held no warmth, only a terrifying amusement. "Everything is property to the man strong enough to take it," he had replied, his voice a low, cultured rumble that was somehow more menacing than a shout. Sarah, her heart pounding, had run from the garden, grabbing the old shotgun from the porch. But she was too far away. Events unfolded with the terrible, unstoppable momentum of a landslide. The leader had given a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The brutish man had dismounted and started walking towards Daniel, a length of rope in his hand. "We're just here for the horses, friend," the man had said, his voice a gravelly lie. No need for anyone to get hurt. Daniel was not a fool. He knew these were not simple horse thieves. He pushed Lucas behind him, shielding the boy with his own body. "You're not taking anything from this valley," he had said, raising the Remington. It was over in a heartbeat. The leader's hand had moved in a blur. The roar of his strange, heavy revolver was a deafening crack that shattered the peace of the valley forever. Daniel was thrown backward, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He fell without a sound. Lucas had screamed, a high, piercing cry of pure, uncomprehending horror. He had tried to run to his father. The young, twitchy outlaw had raised his own pistol, but the leader had stopped him with a raised hand. "No," the leader had said, his voice cold and final. "No witnesses." He had aimed his own weapon, the monstrous limit, and had fired again. The small boy had crumpled to the ground beside his father. Sarah had seen it all. A scream had been torn from her throat, a sound of such raw, animalistic agony that it had made even the killer's pause. She had raised her shotgun, her vision blurred by tears of rage, and had fired both barrels. The range was too great. The buckshot had peppered the leader's horse and torn into his left shoulder, causing him to grunt in pain and surprise. He had looked at her then, his cold gray eyes locking with hers across the pasture. He had seen her, the woman who had just witnessed the annihilation of her world. He had raised his revolver to finish the job, but the brutish man had shouted, "Boss, your shoulder. Let's go. A posse will be coming." The leader had hesitated for a moment, his gaze still locked on Sarah. Then, with another of his chilling and hurried smiles, he had slowly lowered his gun, wheeled his horse around, and ridden away, disappearing back into the trees as silently as he had come. He had not just killed her family, he had left her alive with the memory, a fate he likely considered worse than death. As Sarah sat in her cabin now, the storm-lashed walls around her, the face of the killer was no longer a shadowy figure from a nightmare. It had the face of the man sleeping just a few feet away. The pale gray eyes, the large, powerful frame, the calm, cold demeanor, the magnificent black stallion, now resting in her barn, the unique, deadly Lemet revolver, and the bullet wound, the wound she had given him, in his left shoulder. The pieces weren't just fitting together, they were locking into place with the final, terrible click of a coffin lid. She remembered one last, agonizing detail. As her son had fallen, a small, silver concho, one she had polished for him that very morning, had been torn from the side of his small, child-sized saddle. She had found the saddle later, lying on its side, the leather strap ripped, the concho gone. It had been a small, insignificant thing, piece of a child's tack. But in her mind, it had become a sacred relic, a symbol of the last thing that had been stolen from her. The suspicion was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty, a block of ice forming around her heart. But she still needed the final piece. The proof. The physical, tangible evidence that would turn her certainty into the cold, hard steel of a righteous execution. She knew, with a sudden, chilling clarity, what she had to look for. And she knew she would risk everything to find it. With the dawn of the fourth day, the storm's fury lessened, replaced by a sullen, relentless drizzle. The world outside was a monochrome painting of gray sky and sodden earth. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was more charged than ever. The dynamic had shifted. Sarah was no longer just a reluctant nurse, she was a hunter, stalking her prey within the confines of a four-walled cage. And Jonah, whether he knew the full extent of her suspicion or not, was a cornered animal, his senses on high alert. The day was a long, slow, agonizing chess match. Every word, every gesture, was a move and a countermove. Sarah served him breakfast, a thin gruel of cornmeal and water. It was all she could stomach preparing. She watched him eat, her eyes narrowed, cataloging every detail. The way his left hand, the one on his wounded side, rested near the hilt of the knife on his belt. The way his gaze never settled, always drifting to the door, the window, the shotgun. "The creek will still be too high to cross," she said, her voice a flat statement. "You'll be here another day, at least." "The hospitality of a stranger is a rare thing," he replied, his voice smooth. He was testing her again, probing the limits of her supposed kindness. "Most folks would have left me to the wolves." "There are all kinds of wolves in this world," Sarah said, her eyes locking with his over the rim of her tin coffee cup. Some walk on four legs, some on two. The four-legged ones are more honest about their intentions. Jonah's lips twitched in a semblance of a smile. A wise woman. You learned that living out here alone. I learned it 2 years ago, she said, the words like stones in her mouth. The conversation died, thin-spoken truths hanging heavy in the air between them. He finished his meal, and she took the bowl, the brief contact of their fingers as she took it from him sending a jolt of revulsion through her. She knew she had to get into his saddlebags. They were in the corner of the room, a heavy, rain-darkened leather satchel, where he had dropped them the first night. They were the one place that might hold the proof she so desperately needed. But he was never truly asleep. Even when he dozed by the fire, his rest was light, a predator's nap, his breathing shallow, his body tense to react to the slightest sound. She decided to try a different approach. She would probe his memory, see if she could find a crack in the carefully constructed wall of his lies. You said you were a trapper, she began later that afternoon, as she was mending a tear in one of her own shirts. The simple, domestic act, a bizarre counterpoint to the deadly current running through the room. That's right, he said, watching her needle move in and out of the fabric. What do you trap? Beaver, mostly. Fox, when the price is right. The answers were quick, plausible. The high country, you said, she continued, her voice casual. Up by the San Francisco peaks. That's the area, he confirmed. It's beautiful country, Sarah said, a wistful note entering her voice. My husband took me and my son camping there once. Near a place called Aspen Creek. Do you know it? She was watching him closely now. Aspen Creek was a good 50 miles in the opposite direction of the peaks he had mentioned. It was a deliberate, calculated error, a lie to catch a liar. Jonah's eyes didn't flicker. He didn't hesitate. Can't say that I do, he said smoothly. It's a big country. A man can't know every creek and canyon. He had not taken the bait. He was too disciplined, too smart. Or her guess was wrong, and this entire, terrifying ordeal was a figment of her grief-stricken imagination. The thought was, for a moment, more terrifying than the alternative. Was she going mad? Was she projecting the face of her family's killer onto the first stranger who happened to have a similar gun and a similar wound? The doubt, insidious and cold, crept back in. It gnawed at her, undermining the icy certainty that had been building. That evening, he tried to turn the tables on her. As she tended to his wound, her fingers working deftly to apply a fresh poultice of herbs, he spoke, his voice low and unexpectedly gentle. You're a healer, by nature, he said. It must have been a comfort to your husband. Sarah's hands froze for a fraction of a second. She could feel his breath on her cheek. He was too close. The predator was feigning softness, trying to lull her into a mistake. My husband was the comfort to me, she said, resuming her work, her touch now rougher than necessary, causing him to flinch. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, the words a perfect imitation of sincerity. No woman should have to endure what you have. And no man should have to die in the dirt for defending his own home, she countered, her voice a low, vicious hiss. She pulled the bandage tight, and this time, he could not suppress a sharp grunt of pain. Careful now, he said, and the gentleness was gone, replaced by the familiar, cold steel. A man in my position might think you were doing that on purpose. A man in your position is lucky to be alive at all, she retorted, standing up, putting distance between them. The chess match was over. The pieces were now in open opposition. He knew she suspected him. She knew that he knew. The thin veneer of civility had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, ugly truth of their situation, a hunter and the hunted, trapped in a cage, both waiting for the other to make the final, fatal move. The drizzle outside stopped. The wind died down. A profound, unnerving silence fell over the valley. The storm was ending. Time was running out. She had to get into those saddlebags. She had to do it tonight. The breaking of the storm did not bring relief. It brought a new, more urgent kind of tension. The constant, roaring presence of the wind and rain had been a cloak, a shield of noise that had helped to mask the charged silence within the cabin. Now, with the world outside hushed and dripping, every sound inside was magnified. The pop of a log in the fire, the creak of the floorboards, the shallow, watchful breathing of the man by the hearth, it all became part of a symphony of suspense. Sarah knew that when the morning came, the creek would have subsided enough for him to leave. Her window of opportunity was closing with every tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, a clock Daniel had painstakingly repaired. Its steady, rhythmic beat felt like a countdown to either revelation or failure. Jonah seemed to feel the shift as well. He was no longer feigning sleep. He sat in the rocking chair, his winded shoulder propped on a cushion, the monstrous Lemet revolver now resting on the small table beside him, well within his reach. He was watching her, his gray eyes narrowed, a silent challenge in his gaze. He was daring her to make a move. The evening meal was a tense, wordless affair. The air was so thick with suspicion it felt like a physical weight, pressing down on Sarah's chest, making it difficult to breathe. She knew she could not overpower him, not even wounded as he was. Her only hope was to outwit him. She made coffee, brewing it strong and black, the way Daniel had liked it. The familiar, bitter aroma filled the cabin, a ghost of 1,000 peaceful mornings. She handed a steaming mug to Jonah. "Thank you," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "It will help you stay awake for your journey tomorrow," she replied, her voice level. In her own mug, she had dissolved a small, carefully measured amount of the sleeping draught her father had kept for patients in extreme pain. It was a powerful opiate, derived from poppy extract. Too much would be fatal, a fact she had considered and then dismissed. She did not want to be a poisoner. She wanted to be an executioner. She needed him conscious when the time came. But she needed a small window, just an hour of deep and natural sleep, to find the proof she needed. She sat in her own chair, sipping her untainted coffee, forcing herself to appear calm. The waiting was an agony. The clock ticked, each second a small hammer blow against her nerves. Would he drink it? Did he suspect? He raised the mug to his lips, his gaze still locked on her. He took a long, slow swallow. Then another. He drank half the mug before setting it down. "It's good coffee," he said. Sarah merely nodded, her heart hammering. They sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. Jonah's eyelids began to grow heavy. He fought it, his head nodding once, then snapping back up. He picked up the mug again, as if to use the caffeine to fight the encroaching drowsiness, and drained the rest of it. It was a fatal mistake. 10 minutes later, his head slumped to his chest. His breathing deepened, becoming a low, rhythmic snore. The opiate had done its work. Sarah waited another 5 minutes, her entire body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. She stood up, her movements slow and silent. The floorboards, which had seemed to scream with every step for the past 4 days, now seemed to hold their breath for her. She crept across the room to the corner where his saddlebags lay. They were heavy, made of thick, oiled leather, and smelled of horse, trail dust, and him. Her hands shook so badly she could barely unbuckle the straps. The first bag contained practical items, a spare box of ammunition for the limit, a whetstone, a length of rope, a bag of dried beef. Her desperation grew. What if she was wrong? What if this was all a terrible, grief-fueled fantasy? She opened the second bag. And there, at the very top, lying on a folded shirt, was a small, deerskin pouch. It was the kind of pouch a man might use to carry keepsakes, tobacco, or small treasures. With trembling fingers, she loosened the drawstring and emptied its contents onto the floor. Several items rolled out. A few gold coins. A tarnished silver pocket watch that had stopped at 3:15. A folded, yellowed piece of newspaper, too worn to read in the dim light. And a small, round piece of metal that glinted in the firelight. It was a silver concho, intricately stamped with the image of a soaring hawk. Sarah felt the air leave her body in a rush, as if she had been physically struck. She would have known it anywhere. She had bought it herself at the sutler's store for Lucas's 7th birthday. She had polished it every Sunday. She remembered the way it had flashed in the sun as he rode his little pony, his laughter echoing through the valley. The proof was in her hand, cold hard, and irrefutable. A sound, a low, guttural noise of pure, animalistic agony, was torn from her throat. It was the sound of a wound, 2 years old, being ripped open anew. The grief, the rage, the horror she had kept so tightly controlled for 4 days erupted within her, a volcanic, silent explosion. She wanted to scream. She wanted to take the poker from the fire and drive it through his black heart while he slept. She wanted to make him pay, to make him feel a fraction of the agony he had inflicted upon her. But as she knelt there on the floor, the silver concho digging into her palm, another feeling rose through the inferno of her emotions, the same cold, clear certainty that had guided her since this ordeal began. Her father's voice, her husband's memory, her own unbreakable will, they all spoke as one. This had to be justice. She would not kill him in his sleep. She would not be a murderer, an assassin stooping to his level. She would be the judge, the jury, and the executioner. He would be awake. He would look her in the eye, and he would know why. She carefully, silently, put everything back in the pouch except for the concho. She slipped it into her own pocket. She crept back to her chair, her body moving on pure, cold autopilot. The truth had been revealed. The whispers were over. She sat in the dim, firelit cabin, her hand in her pocket, her fingers wrapped around the small piece of silver. She watched the monster sleep, and she waited for the storm to break. The sleeping draft held Jonah in its grip for a solid 4 hours. For Sarah, it was a lifetime. She did not sleep. She did not rest. She sat in her rocking chair, a silent, black-clad sentinel, and she planned. The grief and rage that had erupted upon finding the concho did not dissipate. They were channeled, refined, cooled into a single, deadly point of purpose. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a terrifying, preternatural calm. The cabin was no longer her home. It was a battlefield she was preparing. Her mind, sharpened by years of frontier pragmatism and the cold, hard lessons of her father, became a tactical map. She saw every object not for what it was, but for what it could become. The heavy oak table could be cover. The iron stove could be a defensive position. The rocking chair he slept in was a death trap. She rose, her movements now devoid of any tremor, and began to make her subtle preparations. She took the heavy shotgun from its place by the hearth. The weight of it was comforting, a solid, reassuring promise. She checked the load, the shells of heavy buckshot. She did not put it back. She laid it across her lap, her hand resting on its stock. Next, she took the small oil lamp from the mantelpiece and placed it on the far side of the main table. When she confronted him, the light would be behind her, putting her in silhouette, making her a harder target to see clearly. He, on the other hand, would be illuminated by the fire and the lamp, his every move, every expression, visible to her. It was a small, simple advantage, but in a fight that would be decided in seconds, small advantages were everything. She thought about his gun, the lawmen, still on the table beside him. For a moment, she was tempted to take it, to unload it. But she dismissed the idea. It was too risky. The slightest noise could wake him, and she would lose the element of surprise. More than that, a part of her, the part that craved not just victory, but absolute, undeniable justice, wanted him to be armed. She did not want to kill a helpless man. She wanted to defeat a monster at its full strength. Her final preparation was the most personal. She went to the small, locked chest at the foot of her bed, the one that held the few precious mementos of her former life. She took out Daniel's revolver, a Colt Army model, its walnut grip worn smooth by his hand. It was clean and well-oiled. She had seen to its care as a way of honoring his memory. She checked its load 6 heavy, .44 caliber rounds. She tucked the revolver into the waistband of her dress at the small of her back, the cold steel a shocking, intimate sensation against her skin. The shotgun was for the confrontation. This was for what came after. As the first, pale, watery light of dawn began to seep through the window, Jonah began to stir. The opiate was wearing off, leaving him groggy, his movements sluggish. He groaned, his head lolling to one side. Sarah's heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. This was it. The calm was over. The final storm was about to break. She had to play her part for a few minutes longer, to lull him into a false sense of security. She rose from her chair, leaving the shotgun behind for a moment, and moved to the stove. She stoked the embers, her hands moving with a practiced, steady rhythm that belied the torrent of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She put a pot of coffee on to boil. The familiar, domestic act was a surreal piece of theater. Morning, Jonah's voice was a rough, gravelly sound. He pushed himself up in the chair, rubbing his face. Slept like the dead. The storm has passed, Sarah said without turning around. You should be able to cross the creek by midday. Good, he said, his voice still thick with sleep. I've imposed on your kindness for too long. She turned then, a tin mug of black coffee in her hand. She walked towards him. He took the mug, his eyes still clouded with sleep. He did not yet see the shotgun in the chair she had just vacated. He did not see the cold, final light in her eyes. She did not retreat. She stood over him, her presence suddenly menacing. Before you go, she said, her voice a low, chilling whisper, I have a question for you. He looked up at her, a flicker of alertness finally cutting through the haze of the drug. He saw the change in her then. The fragile homesteader was gone. The woman standing before him was someone else entirely, someone as hard and unforgiving as the land itself. I found something of mine, she said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, silver concho. She held it out in the palm of her hand, the soaring hawk glinting in the morning light. I believe you've seen it before. Jonah's eyes dropped to the concho. For a single, eternal second, his carefully constructed mask of civility fell away. His eyes, no longer clouded with sleep, widened in a flash of pure, animalistic shock and recognition. He knew. And he knew that she knew. The calm was shattered. The final storm had arrived. The moment stretched, becoming thin and brittle, ready to shatter. The only sounds in the cabin were the hiss of the coffee pot on the stove and the ragged, shallow breathing of two people locked in a fatal embrace of memory and hate. Jonah's eyes, now sharp and utterly cold, flicked from the silver concho in Sarah's palm to her face, then darted to the Lemet revolver on the table beside him. It was a foot from his hand. An impossible distance. His mind, a weapon in its own right, worked with lightning speed, calculating angles, assessing the new, terrifying reality. The mask of the weary traveler dissolved, replaced by the true face of the predator. A slow, chilling smile spread across his lips, a smile of genuine, almost admiring, disbelief. Well, I'll be damned, he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly purr. The little bird remembers. The casual, mocking cruelty of his words was like a physical blow. It was the confirmation, the confession, the final nail in the coffin of her old life. I remember everything, Sarah said, her voice a low, trembling wire of pure, condensed rage. She took a single, deliberate step back, her hand dropping to her side, closer to the shotgun she had left in the rocking chair. You should have been an easy kill, Jonah continued, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. He was stalling, his body tensing, his eyes still on his gun. Just a woman screaming in the distance. But you had a shotgun. And you got lucky. He flexed his wounded shoulder. Caused me a whole world of trouble. The trouble is just beginning, Sarah said. She made her move. It was not a lunge for the shotgun. That was what he would expect. Instead, she kicked a leg of the small table with all her force. It was a desperate, instinctive act. The table tilted, and the monstrous Lemet revolver slid off, clattering to the floor on the far side of his chair. At the same moment, Jonah exploded into motion. He did not go for the fallen gun. He launched himself out of the rocking chair, his sprained ankle forgotten, and lunged not at her, but at the fireplace. He grabbed the heavy iron poker, its tip still glowing a dull red from the embers. Sarah scrambled back, snatching her shotgun from the chair. The cabin, which had been a stage for their tense drama, was now a chaotic, close-quarters battlefield. The space was impossibly small for the violence that was about to unfold. Jonah came at her, the poker held like a short spear, its hot tip sizzling in the air. He was a cornered bear, wounded but immensely powerful. He swung the poker in a vicious arc. Sarah jumped back, the hot iron hissing as it passed inches from her face, the wave of heat scorching her cheek. She brought the shotgun up, but he was too close, inside the weapon's effective range. He swatted the long barrel aside with a powerful backhand, the impact jarring her to the bone. He grabbed the barrel with his left hand, trying to wrench it from her grasp. They struggled, a grunting, desperate dance of death around the small room. He was stronger, his brute force overwhelming her. He was twisting the shotgun, trying to turn it against her. Her finger was on the trigger, but she couldn't get the angle. The barrel was pointing at the ceiling. His face was inches from hers, his cold gray eyes burning with a killer's light, his breath hot and foul. I should have finished the job, he snarled, forcing the barrel of the shotgun down, towards her own body. Sarah knew she had seconds. With a surge of pure, adrenaline-fueled desperation, she released her grip on the shotgun stock with her right hand and drove her fist, clutching the small, hard shape of the silver concho, directly into his wounded shoulder. He screamed, "Ura!" animal sound of pure agony, his grip on the shotgun faltering for a fraction of a second. It was the opening she needed. She twisted her body, wrenched the shotgun free, and stumbled back, creating a precious few feet of space between them. She didn't hesitate. She didn't aim. She fired. The roar of the shotgun in the enclosed space was apocalyptic. It was a physical blow of sound and force that shook the very logs of the cabin. The buckshot caught Jonah square in the chest, throwing him backward as if he had been hit by a cannonball. He crashed against the far wall, his eyes wide with a final, shocked surprise, and then slid to the floor, leaving a grotesque, crimson smear on the pine logs. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was even louder than the blast. It was a silence of ringing ears, of smoke, of the sudden, shocking absence of the monster who had filled her life with his presence for 5 terrible days. Sarah stood, trembling, the shotgun still hot in her hands, its barrel smoking. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the acrid stench of gunpowder. Her home was a wreck. The table was overturned, the floor was splattered with blood, and the body of her family's murderer lay crumpled in the corner. The thunder in the cabin was over. She had done it. She had survived. She had won. But as she looked at the carnage, at the final, brutal proof of the violence she was capable of, she felt no triumph. Only a vast, cold, and hollow emptiness. The echoes of the shotgun blast faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the end of the world. Sarah stood, her body trembling uncontrollably, her ears ringing, the heavy shotgun feeling as if it were welded to her hands. The fight was over. The monster was dead. But the storm inside her was only just beginning to recede, leaving behind the devastating landscape of its passage. She looked at the body of the man she had known as Jonah. He was no longer a predator, no longer a symbol of her pain. He was just a man, broken and bleeding on her floor, his cold gray eyes now empty, staring at nothing. The sight brought her no satisfaction, no righteous thrill of victory. It brought only a deep, soul-crushing weariness. The instinct for survival, the same instinct that had guided her through the last 5 days, took over. Her mind, blessedly, went numb, focusing on the practical, the immediate. She carefully propped the shotgun against the wall. She walked on unsteady legs to the water bucket, dipped a cloth, and began to clean the blood from her face, her hands. The simple, methodical act was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. The cabin was a wreck. Her home, her sanctuary, was now a scene of death, violated and stained. She knew she could not stay here, not like this. She had to erase the mark he had left. She spent the next hour in a grim, detached haze. She righted the overturned table. She gathered the scattered contents of his saddlebags. She found more money than she had ever seen in her life, a small fortune in gold coins and banknotes, the wages of a career of murder and theft. She looked at it with disgust and left it where it lay. Dealing with his body was the hardest part. He was a heavy man, and it took all of her strength to drag him out of the cabin and into the gray morning light. She could not bring herself to bury him. He did not deserve a place in the soil of her valley. She left him in the woods, a good distance from the house, an offering to the scavengers and the harsh, indifferent justice of the wilderness. When she returned to the cabin, the sun was fully up, its pale, watery light streaming through the door. It illuminated the bloodstain on the floor, a dark, ugly wound in the heart of her home. She spent the next 2 hours on her hands and knees, scrubbing at the floorboards with lye soap and boiling water until her hands were raw and the scent of pine and soap finally overpowered the smell of death. By midday, the physical evidence of the nightmare was mostly gone, but the emotional carnage remained. She sank into her rocking chair, the one he had slept in, and the full weight of what she had done finally crashed down upon her. She had taken a human life. She had looked a man in the eyes and killed him. The act had been one of justice, of survival, but it had changed her, irrevocably. She pulled Daniel's Colt from the waistband of her dress. She had not needed it. She looked at the gun, the symbol of her husband's quiet strength, and then at the shotgun, the instrument of her own brutal vengeance. She saw the two paths that had laid before her: to become a monster to defeat a monster, or to hold on to the humanity her family had embodied. A wave of profound clarity washed over her. Her vengeance was complete. The debt was paid. But to continue down that path, to let the hatred and the violence define her, would be to give Jonah a final, posthumous victory. It would be to kill the memory of the gentle, loving woman Daniel had married. She made her choice. She would not become a ghost, haunted by the past, defined by her rage. She would not become a killer. She had fought for her life, and now she would choose to live it. She stood up and walked to the chest at the foot of her bed. She carefully cleaned and oiled Daniel's revolver, her hands steady now. She wrapped it in an oilcloth and placed it back in the chest, alongside her memories. It was a tool of a life that was over. She then took the shotgun, walked to the edge of the woods, and buried it deep in the earth, returning the instrument of her violent justice back to the soil. She returned to the cabin and stood in the open doorway. The storm had washed the world clean. The air was fresh and cool, filled with the scent of wet pine and damp earth. The sun was breaking through the clouds, its light a promise. The valley, her valley, was quiet and at peace once more. She was wounded, she was scarred, and she would never be the same woman she had been. But she was alive, and for the first time into long, dark years, as she looked out at the beginning of a new day, she felt the faint, fragile, and beautiful stirrings of hope. The first light was hers.